Uganda's economy shrank in 2020, the first time in more than a decade, owing to the adverse effects of the COVID-19 lockdown and the negative spillover from the global economic downturn, especially the disruption of demand and supply chains. According to analysis of the Uganda Bureau of Statistics data, gross domestic product, the market value of all the finished goods and services produced within the borders, fell by 1.2% in the 12 months to December last year. The services sector was the most affected by the slowdown in activity in 2020, shrinking by 3.2% on the year basis to 54 trillion shillings and down from the 7.3% increase registered in 2019. With the high-octane general election and the ongoing slow rollout of the vaccines, it is expected that the economy, which has so far been resilient, will gradually rebound. Regardless, the Finance Ministry is projecting a fiscal deficit when government's expenditure exceeds its revenue in a year to widen to 8.6%, up from 7.9% in the last financial year of 2019-2020 and 4.9% in the financial year 2018-2019. As a result, government has had to borrow considerably to plug this deficit. This borrowing, varying from concessional, semi-concessional and non-concessional, has heightened the current risk to debt sustainability to the extent that 55% of revenues collected go to debt servicing, often creating a crisis of liquidity shortage and more borrowing. Such was the case last year in November, in the midst of the election, when the Treasury ring-fenced all available money for State House, Electoral Commission, the Defense Ministry, and payment of salaries, wages and pension, and debt servicing and interest repayment. As a result, the fiscal deficit for the first half of this financial year, 2020-2021, was financed through borrowing from the domestic and external sources to plug the hole. Government received loan disbursements from donors amounting to 3.6 trillion shillings, of which 1.3 trillion shillings was in form of budget support and 2.1 trillion shillings as loans tagged to specific projects. During the period, government borrowed another 4.2 trillion shillings from the domestic market to finance key priorities. Policy documents seen by NTV revealed that the accelerated borrowing, especially from the domestic market, crowded out the private sector from being considered for loans, while at the same time has increased the country's vulnerabilities to the debt outlook.
I wouldn't say our debt is manageable because the cost of servicing that debt is rising day after day. First of all, we are seeing a shift from our traditional lenders who used to offer loans to us at concessional rates of about 2% from the World Bank and IMF, and now we are shifting to private lenders. We are shifting to the private markets. When I say the private markets, Uganda is borrowing from the domestic market at very high rates. About 14%. Those are the coupons we are paying. What I mean by that, we are actually incurring a lot on servicing our domestic debt as compared to what we actually spent prior on servicing our traditional debt that we owe to our traditional lenders.
The International Monetary Fund has set a 50% debt to GDP ratio threshold for developing countries, but Uganda has inched ever closer to surpassing this ceiling. While tax collections have improved considerably over the years, the tax to GDP has not grown correspondingly. On the other hand, expenditure has grown skyward, largely to sustain a bloated government anchored on a clientele patronage politics. In 2020, taxes on products declined by 2.6% to 8.4 trillion shillings from 9% in 2019 as the economy shrank due to the COVID-19 lockdown. Revenue collections for this financial year 2020-2021 have already been downgraded from 21 trillion shillings to 18 trillion shillings, and with the financial year closing in 2 months' time, it's likely this target won't be met. Technocrats blame the poor revenue mobilization on the large size of the informal sector that makes up a sizable chunk of the economy and a sizable part of the population being engaged in the agriculture sector, which is not taxed. Between 2017 and 2020, the country's debt stock grew by 70% from 33.5 trillion shillings in June 2017 to 56.9 trillion shillings in June 2020. Owing to its debt position, the Auditor General John Mwanga detailed in his latest report that the country's credit rating outlook was revised from stable to negative by Fitch Ratings, a credit rating agency that rates the viability of investments relative to the likelihood of default. The above have had a resultant effect of higher cost of borrowing, which may deny future generations the opportunity to sustainably borrow. Mr. Mwanga noted in the report. Chibowa, the Financing for Development Officer at Siatini, an NGO that specializes in trade and policy advocacy, says government could benefit from self-inspection.
We're already in a crisis. Increasing taxes will actually affect our businesses, which are already challenged. So that government is actually facing a real challenge when it comes to fiscal adjustment. Yeah, it can't actually increase taxes at the moment, but it can look at maybe reprioritizing in this current moment. What I mean by that is that maybe resources that were actually being spent on other issues can now be diverted and reprioritized.
From the outset of the COVID-19 pandemic in March last year to February this year, government says it has borrowed $846 million, or the equivalent of 3 trillion shillings externally, of which $611 million or 2.2 trillion shillings were in loans approved by Parliament, and $234 million or 856 billion shillings were grants, as compared to $2.8 billion or the equivalent of 10.2 trillion shillings approved in the financial year 2019-2020. The reduction in borrowing, government says, was on account of being cautious about the debt to GDP ratio amidst the COVID-19 pandemic, which impacted on growth and locally mobilized revenues. However, this doesn't help matters, as the stock of foreign debt disbursed and undisbursed at December 2020 stood at a staggering $11.68 billion or 43.2 trillion shillings, of which $7.3 billion or the equivalent of 26.6 trillion shillings was from multilateral creditors, $3.4 billion or the equivalent of 12.3 trillion shillings was from bilateral creditors, and $885 million or the equivalent of 3.2 trillion shillings was from commercial banks. The country also has a stock of $4.55 billion or the equivalent of 16 trillion shillings as undisbursed debt, mainly from the World Bank, China, Islamic Development Bank, and African Development Fund. In total, this brings the country's total stock of external debt to $16 billion or 59.1 trillion shillings. On the other hand, the total stock of debt contracted from the domestic market increased by 27.3% to 22 trillion shillings, up from 17.3 trillion shillings in December 2019.
Borrowing absolutely is not the problem. It is about responsible borrowing. If you have, say, Mbale, Bumbobi, Luakaka Road, with money borrowed from the African Development Bank in this case, what are the attendant projects for which that road then can be utilized? If not, you just have what they has been called the white elephants kind of scenario. You have a brand new road, Iganga through Tirinyitumbale, but all you see is just drying of cassava, which is if itself is inadequate even in quantities. So that becomes a challenge. You need to have kind of linkages of economic functions that utilize those facilities for which borrowing has been done.
Kapwepwe says both government and the donors are part of the problem.
We are aware that some of the loans have been acquired having bypassed the designated legal and policy process of a country like Uganda. We have also had instances where monies have been pumped onto African governments, and to the extent of such resources being idle for such a long time, from project start, project end, no single coin has been utilized. But the creditor, both the creditor and the lender are part of the problem in that equation. And to that extent, we look forward to, against the heavy debt burden now for Uganda, for East African countries certainly, and low-income countries in Africa for total debt cancellation.
Local civil society organizations have in recent weeks sounded a clarion call by other global actors for the IMF to release up to 3 trillion shillings special drawing rights for developing countries to avert a looming debt crisis and defaulting. Special drawing rights is a form of reserve asset that is used to supplement the official reserves of IMF member countries. The World Bank separately told NTV that government already signed on its debt service suspension initiative, a global initiative aimed at easing the burden of debt service for countries during the COVID-19 pandemic, alongside other 46 poor countries out of the 76 eligible. The bank leads Uganda's debt stock of multilateral creditors with a portfolio of $4.2 billion, or the equivalent of 15.3 trillion shillings, of which $2.4 billion, or the equivalent of 8.7 trillion shillings, or 57% of active portfolio, is undisbursed. From the outset of the COVID-19 pandemic in March last year to date, the bank says $1.4 billion, or the equivalent of 5.1 trillion shillings, has been approved for Uganda, including $338.2 million, or the equivalent of 1.2 trillion shillings, as grants. In an interview with UK's Financial Times on Monday, the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres warned of the spectre of a debt crisis for the developing world, which could plunge countries into a wave of poverty and social unrest. This scenario bears parallels with Uganda. For instance, while the government borrowed less during the pandemic year, it went for bullet disbursements from the likes of Trade Development Bank, IMF, Stanbic Bank, and the World Bank's International Development Association for budget support financing, which grew the stock foreign debt. Bullet disbursements are loans that require the principal balance to be paid in full when it matures, rather than dividing it up into installments over its lifetime. Borrowers only cover interest payments before the final payment is due. For that matter, taxpayers will have to bear the brunt of the proposed raft of new taxes, as government is desperate for money and yet it keeps swelling, the expenditure said, especially for political patronage.